This is ChangeMakers with Katie Gore, finding the right solutions for the affordable housing community.
Welcome back to my conversation with ChangeMaker Frank Woodruff, the Executive Director of the Community Opportunity Alliance. We've been exploring his journey to becoming a champion for community-based development. Frank, we wrapped up part 1 discussing the Storied Communities Initiative. So can you take us behind the curtain and tell us how all that came together?
Yeah, and as I said, our research agenda tries to nurture the identity of the field. And one really important, if not the most important, piece of the field's identity is how it serves the residents of the place that its mission calls them to serve. And so we set out about a year and a half ago, I guess it was, to we approached it from a research lens, like how are organizations, how do they, not necessarily good or bad, but how do they, what are the tools they use to engage residents? And how do residents perceive those tools? Residents, one, that are engaged with the organization already, and residents that are not engaged with the organization, how do we get to them? How do we get them to tell their story? And so we set up a research effort in 4 places: Richmond, California, in the Rio Grande Valley near the Mexican border, Memphis, and Detroit, and identified 4 organizations in those places to partner with. And we hired local literary artists to go out and interview our residents about how they perceive the local organization. And I will say, kind of the punchline is that I would say we at the national level, will speak for myself, underappreciate how perceptive residents are about how these organizations change over time, and how the resources that they have affect what they're able to do. So, for example, one of the findings is that in some, from the research from the Storied Communities Project, is that in some places, residents could witness an organization changing based on where its money was coming from. So as it got more complicated sets of resources, the organizations, the way it engaged with the community changed. And that is something that we kind of see anecdotally from kind of where I sit, but to know that the residents themselves witness that as well tells us something about how connected the fates of residents and organizations really are.
It's an interesting perspective because you're personalizing it, you're highlighting projects, and you're also showing this success record. It's a great platform for you guys to use.
Thank you.
So let's talk about the rebranding. You mentioned it, and I'm curious to know what the thought was behind it and how that has taken hold in what you're doing today. Do you want to share some of that with us?
So it all kind of started in the summer of 2020. It's a time that maybe some of us in this work can remember vividly. But let me ask you, Katie, do you know a movie? Are you familiar with the movie Encanto, the Disney movie?
I am not. I have a lot of kids' movies in my repertoire, but not that one.
Not that one? Well, let me say, I have 2 kids, 5 and 3, and I have seen that movie more times than maybe all your listeners combined. Especially in the last 6 months. But for those who haven't seen it, even those who have, it's a Disney movie about the Madrigal family who has special powers or gifts, miracles that were given to the family's abuela, their grandmother, who kind of plays the matriarch and protagonist in this movie. And they were given to her when she was a young mother, refugee settling in a new land after her husband's demise. But throughout the movie, the miracle that her family had been given is gradually fading. So the abuela is really desperate to preserve it, and she chastises her family's every mistake, thinking that her family's lack of perfection is what's causing the miracle to die. So her grandson drops a plate, or her coming of age granddaughter refuses to marry the abuela's choosing suitor, or the granddaughter with super strength can no longer lift a pack of donkeys and carry them across town, right? So these kind of things. So as the movie goes along, the viewers comes to realize that the tighter that the abuela's fist is squeezing around her family, the weaker the miracle is becoming. So at the movie's climax, the abuela realizes that her obsession with the gift is what's causing irreparable harm to her relationship with her children and grandchildren. It's destroying the family, and as the family deteriorates, so do the gifts. And so the abuela realizes, when she realized that she is in fact the one causing the miracle to die, she admits to her granddaughter, in my darkest moment, I was given a miracle, a second chance, and I became so afraid to lose it that I lost sight of who the miracle was for. And I feel like in the summer of 2020, we had kind of a moment like that. The big community development anyways. The community organizations that are serving the communities we're talking about are incredible gifts to the people and places that they serve. They create home ownership and wealth for families who for generations had none. They provide homes for the homeless. They've been neighborhood leaders in opposing racism and unchecked capitalism. And they even get like the biggest financial institutions in the world to kind of cross those red lines, right? But the miracle isn't necessarily the activities that these organizations do. The miracle is the communities themselves and the institutions they have chosen to build their future. And I feel like in the summer of 2020, that all was laid bare for us. And so we at the NACIDA at the time embarked on a strategic shift to focus more on the systems that impact this work in a much more focused way, and ultimately that materializing to what we call the field building strategy. And so we think that fighting fragmentation in the field of community-based development, creates cohesion within the field. It enhances innovation. It builds capacity, raises visibility of the field to funders and policymakers. And so that's what we try to do. We try to, as I said before, nurture the identity of the field, so that it can be stronger to serve the communities it was made to serve. And so, fast forward a little bit, we make that big strategic decision. We've, did different kinds of internal capacity building stuff. We did bylaws. We hired consultants to kind of help us learn. We had some turnover at the board level, and we changed our brand to support our new vision. And so we transitioned in I went public with it early 2024 from NACIDA to the Community Opportunity Alliance.
So what have you seen as being the response to that? Are people actually leaning in more for the collaboration piece and the community development partnerships? Or are you seeing the brand still try to get its footing? What is your introspective view here for how this is rolled out this year?
I think it's a little bit of both. We are still trying to push the brand. I think it's a long-term effort to get our peers and friends yet to be to see us differently. I think it helps that I've been here so long, right? So for someone who kind of only interacts with the organization on rare occasion, having a consistent kind of face, I think helps. So there are challenges to that. But I would say we've had some really big wins this year that I think are ultimately good for the field. We've been fighting really hard the last 2 years for changes to the home program. I mentioned earlier the home block grant program. HUD is changing the rules, what's called the rules or the regulations for how that program operates. And the regulations that have been proposed and we hope will be finalized by the end of the year or shortly, soon into next year, will be much more friendly to community-based development organizations. And we played a big role in that. And I'm really proud of that work, hoping, again, that it comes out. It comes out in our favor. We're able to get a lot of visibility on the insurance issue. I think that's kind of how we met, right? We got in the New York Times, right? That was a big deal. I certainly never been in the New York Times before. And so, getting visibility for an issue we think is really cares what I think helps our brand and the brand helps it. So we're in the early stages, but so far so good.
Good job on getting some clarifications and some changes on the home program. It has been overly complex, let's say it like that, over the years. So any flexibility or streamlining there is going to be much appreciated. So good job on that. I'm glad you brought up your leadership because you've been there for a while and the Alliance is making great strides under your leadership. So as the organization has evolved, what would you brainstorm? What would you dream if you could take the Community Opportunity Alliance over the next 10 years? Where would you like to see it go in the next decade?
So there are a couple of pieces. One piece of a field building strategy for the Alliance, and for us that's really important is the money, right? So our goal is to grow substantially, but not dramatically, about double our size in the next 3 years. And part of that is engagement in private philanthropy. So on my wish list is for major private philanthropy to re-engage in the field of community development in a way that it hasn't in over a decade. Private philanthropy funds CDCs to do stuff, but they're not necessarily, as much as we would like, invested in the identity of the field as a whole. That can be a little bit squishy, but it's really, I think, really important. So 10 years from now, let's say I'm still here. It's the year, what we're in, 2035 or something. 10 years from now, I would like to be able to say that the Community Opportunity Alliance played a really important leadership role in the field of community development, having a visibility that it has not had in decades. Our organization was founded after the fall of what we call a predecessor organization, an organization called the National Congress for Community Economic Development, NCCED, who played that role for CDCs. And when they died in 2005, there was frankly a vacuum in the field level visibility for community development that has been gone for 15 years or more. And we are working to bring that identity back because the consequences of not having that identity are played out in that 80-20 dilemma that I mentioned. Deeper in those inequities that we talk about is the fact that organizations led by people of color in this field and organizations that represent communities that are largely populated by people of color do worse on every single financial metric that matters in real estate development. And that is a consequence of the system that's been built that supports this field. And so, on my wish list are doubling in size, dealing with some inequities, and a greater visibility for the field as a whole, because it needs it and it's earned it. The fact of the matter is, whether or not the Alliance is around or not, or whether or not the home program is around or the CDBG program is around, whether or not any of that stuff exists, the work of neighbors and community members coming together, forming an institution, saying this place can do better, that spirit's always going to be there. The question is what the system will look like that surrounds that spirit.
And I like that your organization can try to tackle some of those inequities and structural problems at the same time while building capacity on a larger footprint. It's one thing to build that capacity internally at the local level, but you're able to say, hey, wait a minute, why would Des Moines struggle if Youngstown has already figured it out? And so you're able to toss those best practices around and also learn from regulatory hurdles, because let's be honest, sometimes one community gets told no about what can happen with the funding, but yet you've got another community that has already built it with the same funding. And your alliance group is perfectly poised to make some of those inequities as well happen. So a great framework to make this work. So tell me, as we close out, I appreciate you taking the time, but what would be something for our listeners that you would like for them to know as a major takeaway for the Alliance about what you're doing or what your future looks like? What could you give them as one last takeaway?
We haven't talked about the elephant in the room, right? Which is the election. The consequences of that election are substantial. For the purposes of our conversation today, it's going to be incredibly substantial for affordable housing. Regardless of how the elections go in November, there is going to be a congressional debate, let's call it early in the new year, about what to do with taxes. That will impact the low-income housing tax credit, new markets tax credit, any kind of tax incentive used by community development to do a variety of activities. So I think I would like our listeners to be tuned into that because that fight is going to happen regardless of the results of the election. But I don't think the conversation is quite as simple as build, baby, build. While supply is absolutely necessary, the communities that the housing goes into also need to be tended to. And I think that kind of most commonly comes through in kind of like a topic you've had on here, but you've talked about on this podcast before about NIMBYism and not in my backyard. But the kind of antidote to NIMBYism is community-based development, right? These are developers building the housing that have connections to the communities where it's being built. And so I would just like to, as we hopefully start to have a real nuts and bolts nitty-gritty debate about affordable housing supply going into 2025, I hope that community-based development and the organizations that do that work are front and center in that conversation.
And it's interesting because you have Congress who is controlling the purse, and yet it's impacting their communities by which they're voting, because CDBG is one of those signature programs for them in their community for them to go back and attend the ribbon cuttings and attend the improvements. So there's a lot of tension there on what gets cut, what gets funded, and how it impacts those local communities. So this is going to be an interesting race on all fronts to watch.
It will be. And affordable housing has, that dynamic is absolutely true. It's also true that affordable housing has become a surprisingly bipartisan issue. I mean, the low-income housing tax credit improvements to the program is broad bipartisan support. Same thing with the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, which is a tax credit targeting affordable housing as well. It has not been enacted yet, but we've been part of a campaign to pass it for a number of years. But again, bipartisan support. New Markets Tax Credit, which is an economic development tool, also bipartisan support. So there can be fights over the appropriations in any given years, and we can and do, right, like to criticize those elected that don't necessarily see things the way we see them. But at the same time, regardless of how the elections turn out, there's real opportunities for housing as part of this tax debate next year. And I think we're all going to be ready for it.
For those of us who have been in this for a few decades, we have seen the trend, and it used to be arguing over the need. And the need is known on both sides. So now it is down to solution making and funding, and that's a good conversation to have.
Absolutely. I couldn't have put it better, Katie. I'm probably going to use that line. That's a really good one.
Go for it. Well, Frank, thank you for taking the time. Again, I've been talking with Frank Woodruff, the Executive Director of the Community Opportunity Alliance.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for putting affordable housing front and center.
Thanks for listening to ChangeMakers with Katie Gore. To find out more about Katie, go to quadel.com. That's QUADEL.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.